Our lead speaker this morning on our first panel is Julie Pizzetti. Julie is the editorial director of this Media 140 conference in Sydney. Julie's an award-winning, internationally published academic. She's a former ABC journalist, spending some time alongside me, in fact, in the ABC's Parliament House Bureau in Canberra for Radio Current Affairs. These days, she's a lecturer in broadcast journalism at the University of Canberra. She blogs at JScribe, she freelances for traditional media, she tweets up a storm, and she recently gave birth to the winsome Amalia Grace. So we're actually very lucky she's here because that was very recent. Julie is joined on the panel by Margaret Simons. Margaret Simons is chair of the recently established Foundation for Public Interest Journalism at Swinburne University in Melbourne. She writes media commentary for Crikey and for her blog The Content Makers, which was also the title of her most recent book. Mark van Niekerk is editor-in-chief of Fairfax Digital, and he's led online editorial development of Fairfax Media's newspapers since June 2001, including the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age in Melbourne, and two paperless newspapers, the brisbanetimes.com.au and wtoday.com.au, market leaders for monetising online news and information. Jonathan Green is editor of Crikey. His bio tells us he's been a journalist since sometime in the mid-19th century, and with his profoundly analogue track record, he's bemused to find himself at the superating edge of new media as editor of Crikey. He tweets a lot. He reckons he almost tweets as much as at Mia Freedman. And finally, Robin Williams is the presenter of ABC Radio National's Science Show. Early in his career, you might be really surprised to know that Robin was an actor and made appearances in The Goodies, Monty Python's Flying Circus and Doctor Who. Is that true? For the Science Show, he's conducted countless interviews with scientists, ABC TV, radio. He's appeared in World Safari with David Attenborough. Get out. And in 1993, he was the first journalist elected as a fellow member of the Australian Academy of Science. I think you might describe him as a little bit of a doubter in the Twitterverse. He still thinks the lead pencil has a lot going for it when it comes to transmitting the news. So let the panel begin. Julie Pizzetti is our first speaker.
Thank you. And I might close at ABC Mark Scott's laptop so that I can manoeuvre my way around here. Reinventing journalism, 140 characters at a time. My point is, it's a revolution, not a war. The fall of Rome is a rich metaphor that was tapped recently by Mark Scott to powerfully evoke images of the collapse of traditional media houses, especially the anachronistic print barons like Rupert Murdoch. What worries me, though, beyond the inevitable end of the traditional print model of journalism, at least in developed Western democracies, is the Nero-like behaviour of some of the most respected journalists and editors in the so-called legacy media, both here and abroad. There's been much fiddling while Rome burns, and part of the problem, to further mix my Roman history metaphors, is the failure of some media outlets, the ABC being a notable exception, and journalists to lend the masses their ears. Within some journalistic circles, there's continuing arrogance towards media consumers and users, the people formerly known as the audience, to quote NYU Professor Jay Rosen, who'll deliver tomorrow's keynote address. This arrogance is well demonstrated by the sneering derision and cynicism directed towards the phenomenally popular microblogging platform Twitter, which we've already heard so much about, and those who tweet, by the defenders of old, unsustainable models of publication and an inflexible attitude towards definitions of journalism. To begin to talk about the future of journalism, we must start by agreeing that the struggle shouldn't be focused just on saving print, nor does it simply revolve around identifying alternative business models. Those who say the concurrent crises confronting journalism are only technological and economic are kidding themselves. There's also the loss of public trust in mainstream journalism, fuelled by tabloidisation, the product of a decline which reflects the misidentification of the need for engagement with the need for sensationalism. It's a loss of faith magnified within online communities, where mainstream media are often viewed cynically as bent on controlling an agenda that's skewed in favour of the powerful or vested corporate interests. Such distrust escalated in the face of the sloppy journalism that bordered on propaganda that accompanied the weapons of mass destruction debate, to name just one example. In the social media age, it may be true that anyone can call themselves a journalist if they have the skills to gather, synthesise, analyse and distribute information with a captivating narrative. But it's also true that professional journalists have never had their professional practice so closely scrutinised. There are millions of online fact-checkers, bias police and critics out there. And credibility within online communities built on active engagement will be crucial to the sustainability of any professional journalism model into the future. So I argue that the only struggle critical to the future of journalism is one designed to ensure the continuation of our core professional practice, that is, shining a light into dark places, speaking truth to power, and doing so without fear or favour, but with a commitment to accuracy, truth and fairness. Of course, in order to do that, we need to identify sustainable funding models. Opinion might be cheap, but quality reporting does cost money. We also need sustainable new audiences in new space for our work. And in considering how we should achieve that, we need to accept that journalism isn't simply narrowly defined as news reporting, and be prepared to part with that increasingly unworkable and misunderstood sacred cow of 19th century Western models of journalism, objectivity. Social media platforms like Twitter, YouTube and Facebook are changing the way we do journalism. And they're affecting our professional and ethical constructs in the process, while allowing the people who sustain us, our increasingly interactive audiences, greater access to us and more power to independently set news agendas and frame news values. All of this makes for very challenging times for professional journalists, and it's tempting to take up arms and dig in. There are livelihoods at stake, not just empires, traditions and ideals, of course. But it's vital to accept that this is a revolution, not a war. Time for transformation, revitalisation and reinvention. A continuation of the sort of mindset that replicates a form of trench warfare where we have imperialist generals entrench us in rotting surrounds and force us into futile, deadly battles will just lead to body piles in journalistic no man's land, in my view. The alternative, this revolutionary mindset, involves a passionate embrace of change for good, change for a new media world order, a world where information gathering and distribution is more equitable and representative. And we don't embark on such a campaign uncritically. Of course, we must be aware of the pitfalls, but neither can we be hamstrung by fear or reluctance or intransigence or arrogance. Some battles will be lost and there may be bloodshed, but the end result doesn't have to be the displacement of our core value as journalists and citizens. And in the social media age, the nexus between those two is critical. Debates about the future of journalism in Australia have crossed over into Twitter in recent months. On this very newsworthy new news medium, journalists are openly discussing ethics and professional practice, both as they apply to traditional media and to social media. And they're discussing this with other users. They're crowdsourcing solutions to the dilemmas posed by constructively and profitably reaching across the walls of their own media organisations to colleagues in other camps, freelance journalists, citizen journalists, bloggers, academics and active citizens of all persuasions. This vibrant forum has emerged on the back of what I identified in April as a veritable explosion of Australian journalists in the Twitterverse. And as Twitter has become a zone for publishing breaking news and aiding reporting, it's also become a hot news item. Indeed, in the 8 months since I began formally researching Twitter and journalism in connection, it's gone from a news curiosity to a virtual media cliché. So, to drill down below the rhetoric and to contextualise another core journalistic skill, let's look more closely at Twitter. And some of you will have, no doubt many of you will have heard these statistics already, but in case there are people who remain ignorant, it's the fastest growing communication platform in the world. Last week, The Guardian reported that it is expected to reach 25 million users by the year's end. And one of the most prolific tweeters on the site reported this week that Twitter management had revealed there were 45 million unique visitors to Twitter during June, coinciding with the Iran uprising. These are the sorts of numbers which prompted one of the most popular tweeters, Stephen Fry, to ask recently, is Twitter the new fifth estate? Whether the fourth estate, you might ask. The Guardian also reported last week that a leaked document from within Twitter indicated the company hoped to hit 1 billion users by 2013, at which point they would consider Twitter to be the pulse of the planet. Even with the capacity for penetrative mobile phone-driven tweeting, though, chances are it'll be, at best, the pulse of the technologically privileged in developed countries. But that's nothing to be sniffed at by journalists or traditional media outlets. So in preparing this presentation, I thought about speaking solely on my recent research, the academic approach, but while organising the conference and engaging in online debates and participating in mainstream media interviews, it became clear to me that there was still a lot of ignorance and arrogance, and I was increasingly frustrated with the level of research that accompanied some journalists' line of questioning. I was asked more than once, how could you possibly have a meaningful conversation in 140 characters? And I'd politely answer, it's not limited to 140 characters. Each tweet is measured that way. But just like a real conversation, it can go back and forth with multiple questions and answers of that length. I lost count of the number of times this statement, masquerading as a question, was put to me. Isn't Twitter just a platform for narcissism and banality? No, it's certainly not. And if one more journalist says to me, but Twitter isn't journalism, I might be forced to stab myself in the eye with a fork. It'd probably be less painful. Let's get this straight. No, Twitter isn't journalism. It's a publication platform. But a journalist who tweets live from the scene of an event is surely doing journalism. And one who finds and interviews a source or crowdsources case studies via Twitter is certainly reporting. And what is it with the you can't say anything meaningful in 140 characters line anyway? Isn't writing a headline, usually much shorter than 140 characters, and Mark provided us with some excellent historical examples, isn't that a powerful journalistic act? Is haiku poetry? Surely if 17 syllables can be poetic, why can't 140 characters be journalistic? Perhaps Twitter is journalism's haiku. And remember, a world religion was built on this sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's how the Bible, the best-selling book of all time, apparently, begins powerfully, succinctly, in 55 characters. Perhaps God would make an excellent tweeter. But to come directly to the question posed by the panel's theme, no, Twitter isn't journalism's saviour, but neither is it journalism's Satan. And by the language used to bag Twitter by some resistors and detractors, it's almost apocalyptic. The subtext is, the interweb is evil. The otherwise brilliant Sydney Morning Herald chief correspondent Paul McGough, whose work I admire immensely, pursued that line, the interweb is evil, at the ANU conference on war and new media where we both spoke last month. He told the audience, remember all the talk of how the internet would democratise news and information? I don't buy it. The reverse is true. It's a tool for ignorance, for robbing society of valuable pillars of democracy. He went on to say that while he'd opened a Twitter account, he hadn't uttered a single tweet. Chris Uhlmann, where are you? You've learned the lesson. He felt he couldn't say anything of value in 140 characters. And tellingly, he said he didn't need Twitter because he had ample platforms already, and he rattled off radio, television, newsprint, the Herald's website. And that was a point which resonated with those following the conference on Twitter and via other online forums. They wanted to know why should the only valid platforms be the ones controlled by journalists. But Paul did confess he was, quote, an old fart. And he said he was keen to extend the conversation. He was hoping to be able to join us today, but he's on assignment, and I hope he'll watch the debate unfold on Twitter. But despite my disagreement with Paul's views about Twitter, he at least made an effort. He'd opened an account, he'd acknowledged the value of journalists monitoring what goes on in the space. Many of the journalists who've interviewed me in recent months about my research on Twitter and journalism seem to feel entitled to draw conclusions based on shallow research and narrow assumptions. And the biggest detractors have never been on Twitter. To me, that's not good journalism, and it's certainly not good research. So yes, I'm a fan of what Twitter offers, and I don't say Twitter is necessarily the platform. I believe that the concept will exist into the future. It's here to stay. It may present itself with another name, of course, in years to come. But I don't suggest it's going to displace traditional media, nor is it a replacement for long-form investigative journalism or features. Rather, it's an adjunct to it. It can be an enhancement, and it has the potential to amplify our work through mass distribution to new audiences. After surveying 25 journalists this year and devoting many hours to active research as a tweeter, I concluded that it's one of the new essential tools in a journo's kit bag. It's a platform to aid research, to report breaking news, distribute stories and engage with audiences. To some, it's like a favourite journo's watering hole, a public pub debriefing zone, if you like. To others, it's a public notepad which exposes the practices and processes of journalism to audiences, enhancing the craft's transparency, and it's a live contact book, all rolled into one. I therefore believe journalists do need to be invaders in the Twitter sphere. As one of my interviewees said, journalists need to be everywhere where information is being traded and news and ideas are being exchanged. Journalism's a conversation, and believe it or not, any crusty curmudgeons in the back row, intelligent, informed conversation is happening on Twitter between journalists, experts and sources, between journalists and their audiences. And while using Twitter to circumvent spin and identify angles and contacts outside the pack, or at least in contest with the press release, thankfully, journalists are making profitable connections with people who they may otherwise not have encountered across cultural barriers and national borders. They're broadening their horizons 140 characters at a time. I started my life as a radio news journalist with skills honed inside these walls. I was taught that accuracy, brevity and clarity were the ABC of good news writing, and Twitter's one of the new tools I now use in my journalism classes at the University of Canberra to teach my students that pithiness can pack real punch. In September 2008, I took them on a political reporting exercise to cover the ACT election. And some of the journalists in the tally room came up to see what they were doing. Most of them had never heard of Twitter, but in the past year it's made headlines around the world. And this momentum has driven the opening up of the Australian Houses of Parliament to live reporting, with journalists now interactively tweeting question time, a reporting practice that's attracting new audiences to the discourses of Australian democracy. And that process is being led by the very witty Annabelle Crabb, who'll be with us later for a panel that looks specifically about political reporting. There's also the iiNet trial. In early May this year, I tweeted, what's the difference between a journo tweeting or live blogging a court case and a reporter text messaging a judgment from the courtroom? Well, last month, the Federal Court overturned a decades-long bar on reporting from within a courtroom and accommodated Twitter, afterwards acknowledging its potential value. Meantime, though, the Australian barred one of its pioneering journo twits, Andrew Colley, from live tweeting the case, while they assessed the legal and business implications. By contrast with what we just heard from Mark Scott, how very myopic and unadventurous was that? Of course, Twitter isn't journalistic utopia, though. There are a number of significant challenges in the course of my research. I've identified the potential conflict between the personal and the professional, and we saw that starting to play out in the guidelines that Mark showed us earlier. And that's created by a medium that encourages private reflections in a public space. And as much as many journalists, including me, and I have, with some notoriety, tweeted through my pregnancy and in the aftermath of the birth of my daughter, we struggle with this perceived conflict. But I have concluded that the humanising effect of removing that professional mask and revealing aspects of personality and private experience is quite valuable. It's also valued by online audiences where authentic voices are highly rated. And through this process, journalists are forging online relationships with media consumers, creating individual brands that draw new audiences to their work. The biggest test for journalism and Twitter to date came during the Iran uprising, where citizen journalism, crowdsourcing and the speed imperative combined, in the absence of a professional media presence, to produce a seismic shift in reporting practice. Publish first and check the facts later became an established protocol. User-generated content from protesters and observers on the ground was published ahead of verification. And that happened on the websites of some of the world's most reputable mastheads, including the New York Times. It was a watershed foreign reporting moment which highlights the challenges posed by Twitter and other real-time mediums to the essential journalistic values of truth and accuracy. So while embracing exciting new publication platforms and information-oriented communities, we need to remember that accuracy and verification are the antidotes to an overdose on speed. But if there's one case study that globally proves the value of Twitter to journalists, it's Trafigura. And as Alan Rusbridger of The Guardian, the editor of The Guardian, put it, A mix of old media and the Twitter sphere blew away conventional efforts to buy silence. The story, as most of you will be aware, revolved around an attempted cover-up by the Trafigura Trading Company, which was the subject of a mass litigation for injury to 30,000 citizens of Ivory Coast following a toxic sludge dumping incident. At first, the company succeeded in obtaining a gag order on The Guardian to stop it revealing a leaked report that was associated with the case. But when the company succeeded in obtaining a super injunction from the British courts to prevent it from preventing an MP's question to Parliament about the case, effectively overturning 300 years of media freedom, Rusbridger saw red and turned to Twitter, posting this tweet. And I seem to have sped through that, and I need to wind up at any rate. Rusbridger wrote of the experience, "By the time I got home, after stopping off for a meal with friends, the Twitter sphere had gone into meltdown. Twitterers had sleuthed down Farrelly's questions, published the relevant links, and were now seriously on the case. By midday Tuesday, Trafigura was one of the most searched terms in Europe, helped along by retweets by Stephen Fry. Many tweeters were just registering support or outrage, but others were beavering away to see if they could find suppressed information on the far reaches of the web. Common hashtags were quickly developed, making the material easily discoverable. By lunchtime, an hour before we were due in court, Trafigura threw in the towel, blown away by a newspaper together with the mass collaboration of total strangers on the web." As Rusbridger observed in the aftermath, Twitter's detractors are used to sneering that nothing of value can be said in 140 characters, but my 104 characters did just fine. This case demonstrates the capacity for journalists to use Twitter as a massive human search engine to sift the tons of information available online in a collective effort for the benefit of both excellent journalism and democracy. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you very much, Julie Pizzetti. A revolution, not a war, but there was a lot of fighting words in that speech. Our next panellist, we've got 4 more panellists to get through. If each of you could just give a brief 4 or 5 minute presentation, just to leave room for some questions, and I will give us a 1 minute wind-up if we're going too long. Could I introduce now Mike van Niekerk? Mike is the Editor-in-Chief of Fairfax Digital.
Thanks very much, Fran. I'll be very brief. That's quite an act to follow. Imperious generals rotting corpses. I wonder where I am. I subscribe to the view that Richard Sambrook, the head of global news at BBC, put out a couple of weeks ago that Twitter is something, or social media in general, is something that is highly overrated at this point in time, but highly underrated in the long term. The way that we approach social media at Fairfax is obviously we see, unlike the ABC in some senses, but very similar to them, because we're a commercial organisation, we need to build our audiences. We need to see where the audiences are that are developing. So it's therefore very important for us to be aware as possible of where the audiences are and how we can get to them and see what they're saying. So we also believe that audiences are now very much part of the journalism that we create, that it is a two-way conversation and it's not the old-fashioned style. Although this is something that I will admit that my colleagues and I have found some trouble coming to terms with over the years. I recall being at a conference in California 5 years ago, one of the early versions of perhaps this kind of conference called We the Media, when the journalism educators and media practitioners in the United States were getting quite excited about the utopian ideals of audiences becoming involved in the two-way discussion of reporting on events and journalism. And it was quite interesting back then because everyone had Wi-Fi connections and were microblogging to blogs. And I see everyone in the audience here has got their laptops open and are probably sending tweets and blogs as well. But we've come quite a long way since then. I mean, things like Twitter and Facebook went around back then. And what's fascinating to see their growth. I think Julie mentioned a couple of figures there, but I think June the latest numbers were taken. Comscore did a check, and there were about 45 million users of Twitter, 500 of YouTube, about 450 of Facebook. But the growth rates are interesting. YouTube are growing at, I think, about 35%, had grown 35% the previous year. Facebook by 153%, and Twitter by 1,171%. So that just shows that obviously this is a force to be reckoned with. How do we use it as journalists? That's, I think, the question people want to ask me and want to know the answers to. I can't speak for all of Fairfax. I can only talk about the journalists that work for me in the online area. Most of them use Twitter every day and all the time, and it's an important tool. For some, though, of course, it's not as useful as you would think. One journalist described it to me yesterday as just a huge echo chamber when they're out there trying to look for things or tweeting and looking for responses. But as I said, it's obviously going to grow. But to give you some concrete examples, for instance, Arjun Ramachandran, one of our online reporters at the Sydney Morning Herald, a couple of weeks ago, the body was found in Liverpool in a block of flats, and he got the first notification from the police, and his first impulse after that was to look on Twitter and see if there's anything out there. And in fact, there were a number of people that were looking down from a block of flats, from different blocks of flats and buildings, watching the police at work. So he, in fact, contacted them and asked them if he could get more information directly from them, and some of them sent him pictures. And this all happened in the space of about 20 minutes, and at the end of half an hour after the police notification of a body being found in this place out in the car park in Liverpool, we had a story up on the Sydney Morning Herald website with contributions from our readers. So look, I'm happy to take questions at the end. Francis, give me the wind-up over here. Look, as I said again, it's very early days for social media. We're obviously using it, and I can tell you more later on how we've put applications into our website, the way that we're using it, the way we're developing new tools. It's certainly a huge tool for us, and we're about to release, just to our journalists, a very, very powerful tool that will enable us to find stories before they're even out there, as they're starting to bubble up. And this is not just trending stuff. This is a really, really powerful, deep tool. So that's all I have to say for now.
Thanks very much, Mike. Mike van Niekerk from Fairfax Digital. And yes, there will be time for questions afterwards. Could you please welcome now Margaret Simons? Margaret is chair of the recently established Foundation for Public Interest Journalism at Swinburne Uni.
Hello, everyone. Well, I, like many of the journalists here, am basically an old-fashioned broadsheet newspaper journalist who's been forced into making a transition. And the person who forced me into making that transition was Eric Beecher in 2005, when he approached me. I was just freelancing at the time to write regularly for Crikey on the media, which of course is a challenge because there's no way of making yourself unpopular like writing about your colleagues. In that first conversation, we anticipated that the day would come when I would have to write about him, and indeed about Crikey, possibly in a negative way. And he assured me that I would be free to do that. Well, I'm here to tell you that the day may have arrived. In the next week, I expect to be writing that story. And I've got no reason to believe that it won't be published. In fact, I've had assurances from all around that it will be. But it occurred to me to think about how things have changed just since 2005. Because let's suppose that Crikey wasn't prepared to publish something which I thought it was important to get out there. I would now have any number of options to get that information out. There's New Matilda, Inside Story, Opinion Online, probably even ABC Unleashed. Or I could simply take my blog, The Content Makers, and establish it independently of Crikey. It would be harder, of course, and I wouldn't have the considerable benefits of getting traffic that's been referred by Crikey. But I could use Twitter to promote the content, and I have no doubt that, though it may take a little longer, it would find a very similar audience to what it would have done on the Crikey website.